Hello and welcome to Module 4 for Rehab 600. Just to make a note of this, this is a very large module with lots of information, and because of that, it's a 2-week module. So if you're looking at it thinking, oh my goodness, what has Dr. Simpson done to us? I've given you a lot of time. That's what I've done to you. So take your time in going through all the content in this Module 4 because it's really important. Thank you all for your participation in Module 3's discussion. Everybody did a great job again, as expected. I'm glad that I gave a little preparation in terms of what the disability IAT was, the purpose of doing it, and all of that, but I really enjoyed reading all the discussion posts. This week and next week, you will note that in addition to all the information, you also have a discussion, and your first assignments are due. So your rehabilitation legislation assignment is due, and your mental health legislation assignment is due as well. Within Module 4, you will see the drop boxes for both of them. Please separate them. They're two separately graded activities because they can really differ. The format, we just kind of leave up to you guys. I leave up to you guys. You can do a paper, short paper, please. A little video if you'd like. You can feel free to post the video on the discussion board because the discussion board is basically where you're picking between the two pieces of legislation that you worked on for the assignment, pick between two of them, post some basic information up about that piece of legislation. In addition to that, I want some media related to that. So that could be like a recent news article, a clip from a news station, whatever it might be. Something that's related to the actual piece of legislation, something that's happened recently with it. Good or bad, doesn't matter to me. It can be bad, that's fine, because not all legislation is good legislation, and we find that out as we get out into the real world. So I'm going to circle back to the actual assignment here, because you could do a brochure for one, a video for the other, a paper for one, a PowerPoint presentation for the other. They're two separate actual assignments. So make sure you put them in the right Dropbox, number one, and that way I can get them graded. I'll try to start just grading them as I see them come in. If you haven't discovered yet, typically Fridays are my grading day. I try to get the bulk of my grading done on a Friday so that you guys have your grades back and so that I have a weekend, or the most part of a weekend that I could possibly have. So I'll try to get them back as I see them come in, since there's a good amount of time for you guys to submit them. So just be looking out for that. I do provide feedback within the grades, so make sure to take a look at that as well. If I'm going to provide feedback, that's where it's going to be. Same goes with the discussion posts. Some of you may or may not have seen feedback. If you don't see any feedback, doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It just means I don't have any feedback to give you that week. So make sure to check that when you're looking at your grades. Another key point that I like to make about the rehabilitation legislation assignment in particular, whenever I'm talking about rehabilitation legislation, I am not talking about reforms within the prison systems. I'm not talking about individuals who are incarcerated and rehabbing out of that system. That is not the focus of rehabilitation legislation. Rehabilitation legislation is disability focused. And so that would be like the Americans with Disabilities Act or certain sections of it. That would be the Rehabilitation Act and certain sections of it. So that's the rehabilitation legislation. I like to make the point of that because the term rehabilitation can mean lots of different things. Rehabilitation can, in my point of view, include laws related to individuals in recovery. So, that's me. I don't know if everybody else would feel the same way, but I do feel like that there's some overlap there, more or less. So, and you'll notice that as you kind of go through this module with all the laws you're learning about. For this module as well, you will notice that there are two different PowerPoints and there are two different lectures. So the first lecture in PowerPoint is specific to the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is one of the most influential pieces of legislation that our country has seen that's related to people with disabilities in more recent years. And in 2008, the ADA was amended, and you'll learn more about that process and why it was amended within those presentations. The presentation is given by the Job Accommodation Network, agency that's near and dear and close to my heart very good friends that work down there, and you will be listening to Linda Batiste, who has a background in law and has worked for Jan for decades at this point. So she's most definitely a subject matter expert in all things ADA related, and I highly value her presentation skills. She taught me how to do presentations back in the day at Jan too. So please enjoy her video. There is a associated transcript if you need it, or if you want to print it out. With the notes, the lecture notes for this module, so now it's just kind of time to jump right into graduate studies. I am expecting that you kind of fill it out on your own. So as I go through this lecture for the PowerPoint, the second PowerPoint on disability legislation, other legislation, all the fun stuff, make sure that you're kind of keeping track and taking notes. This is a really important module for the exam. I'll say that, okay? One of the questions I always ask is, how many employees does an employer have to have in order to be covered under certain laws, okay? So you want to make note that under the ADA it's 15 or more, 15. Under family medical leave it's 50 or more. I don't get into the minutia of the geographics of family medical leave because there are lots of loopholes within that law in terms of where your employees actually reside and whether or not you have to comply with it. But nevertheless, I digress. ADA 15, FMLA 50. So two important numbers to remember. Just gave you a nice good hint there for the exam. So try to take some notes as we move along today. I will try my darndest to not bore you with all of these pieces of legislation. And honestly, we spent a good amount of time going over the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, so I'm not really going to talk a lot about that. Remember, the Rehab Act of 1973 applies to all things related to the federal government, right? Federal programs, programs that are duly funded by the federal government, by states. It applies to federal contractors. It prohibits discrimination in all aspects of that: employment, access to services, technology, information that we're seeing on the internet that's got the .org, .gov, whatever ending it does have on the internet. So Rehab Act 1973 really the overreaching goal of the Rehab Act when it was established was to have comprehensive programs that are coordinated and collaborating with each other, that are effective and efficient, and are held accountable by reporting measures that assist individuals in our communities with disabilities. So the programs can serve public and private sectors, but again, it's all going to be tied back to where the funding initially comes from, and federal funding with the Rehab Act. State VR programs are a really important thing that came out of the Rehabilitation Act, right? And state VR programs are the programs that some of you are working for, and VR is vocational rehabilitation. In West Virginia, it's the Department of Rehabilitation Services. In Pennsylvania, it's Office of Rehabilitation. Now see, they all have different names here, and I get them jumbled up in my head. But DRS is what it is in West Virginia. If you're not familiar with your state voc rehab agency, I encourage you, implore you to go to their website, and look it up and see what services are offered. These programs are specifically there to assist with helping people with disabilities, helping students and youth with disabilities now to find and maintain competitive and integrated employment. They serve a lot of people. Unfortunately, RSA doesn't update their website as much as I would like them to, and so I only have stats from 2016, even though I know they've been working since then, but they've served a lot of people consistently. The reports that come in from states show that there is a benefit economically to serving individuals with disabilities in terms of the money spent on providing the services versus the money that goes back into the economy as a result of these individuals obtaining employment. Family medical leave, like I said, I'm going to shoot through all of these pretty quickly because there are a lot of them. So the Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA, as most of us know it by, is a federal law as well. It applies to private employers with 50 or more employees, public agencies, state, local, federal governments, yada, yada, yada. It provides coverage to employees who have worked a certain number of hours in a calendar year. Typically, it kind of equates to like a full-time status, basically. But it provides employees with up to 12 weeks of unpaid, yay, job protected really yay, leave during that year. So there is not a paid benefit with family medical leave. That's a common misconception out there. Some states have adopted paid leave policies. Some communities within states, some cities have adopted pieces of legislation that apply to, like, San Francisco, for example, where employees do get paid leave for a certain amount of time. But that does not apply to everybody. Here in West Virginia, when I take my medical leave because I have a baby, I don't get paid for that. I have to use my accrued paid leave, so I can use vacation time, sick time, things like that. But the FMLA, at the heart of it, does not provide paid benefits. Other unique things about family medical leave that really do apply to you all as future counselors. Your clients may need to use their family medical leave time. They may need to use it intermittently to come and see you if they have to take off work during the day. You may be required to participate in the process of having paperwork completed so that they can access their family medical leave if they need to take some time off. If somebody is going into a like an inpatient treatment facility that's supported, and all of that's supported by their employer, and they're able to do that, it may be that you're completing paperwork that would help them have a protected job, or their job protected for 12 weeks. The law was established because essentially employees that were needing time off to address their own medical health conditions, to help care for a parent, a grandparent, a spouse, child, whoever it might have been, were basically just getting fired from their jobs. Didn't matter how much time they needed to take off, they were just getting fired. And so that was kind of the purpose of this law, was to ensure that people could take the time that they needed to address their personal health, the health of others, and then come back to work in the same job that they left. Or if there are certain, again, loopholes with all of these, but if somebody's job was an essential job, then if it needed to be filled, they come back to a position that's kind of like equal status, essentially. Each of these laws are enforced by different agencies, which again is really key for you to know as a counselor, because if a client comes to you and they feel like they're being discriminated against, and that discrimination could fall under one or more of any of these laws, you would need and should be able to refer them to the right agency to help them get a complaint filed, help them through the process of that if need be. So as far as family medical leave goes, the Department of Labor is the enforcement agency for family medical leave. And they have their own website. It's Wage and Hour Division. Put the phone numbers up there. They haven't changed that since I've been aware of it. And again, just to reiterate, some states do have their own family leave type laws, paternity leave, maternity leave, whatever it might be. So it's important to know what laws exist on your state level as well. And those are constantly changing, to be honest. Okay, moving right along. So veterans. So there are protections for veterans that are called out to duty that allow them to come back, essentially, and come back to their jobs. Again, keep in mind, all these laws were enacted because employers were doing really nasty things like firing veterans, right? I mean, who does that? But the Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act, USERRA, was passed in 1994. Basically, it says that any employer, doesn't matter if you're private or public, if you have an active duty military employee that's in the military, they're called out to duty to serve, you have to reinstate their job and continue their benefits, even more importantly, when they're able to come back within a 24-month period. So that 24-month period is kind of key too, but it really does offer some protection for veterans and those who serve our country against retaliation and discrimination, basically just being fired for serving our country. This law is enforced by the Department of Labor, specifically the Veterans Employment and Training Service programs, okay? So sometimes there are these sub-departments and agencies that actually enforce these laws. You will learn from reading about the Americans with Disabilities Act that the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, is the one that enforces Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the employment provisions of the ADA. And then other entities like the Access Board enforce different of different other titles of the ADA. I'm getting off track with that. So moving on to slide 7, and WIOA, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Relatively new act, really shook up the how the state VR programs were operating. Transition services were the big thing that came from WIOA that have impacted rehabilitation counselors. So transition services are essentially those services that are provided to students and youth with disabilities within the high school settings. And traditionally, they've always been provided. It was always mandated that by the REHB Act that services were provided to individuals who are transitioning from high school, from secondary education to post-secondary education, training programs, or right into the workforce. What WIOA did was put an additional focus on pre-employment transition services. So instead of rehab counselors working with possibly juniors, but largely seniors in the high schools, now they're getting in and working with younger adolescents, 14, 15-year-olds, so that those individuals that have disabilities are referred by the schools can really get the services established and in place by the time that they are exiting that secondary school environment. There was also an emphasis within WIOA and a lot of different changes that were made to other service providers like job centers, adult services, services that are provided to marginalized populations, to populations of individuals that have historically been oppressed. So there have been steps that were taken that ensure that these programs were really working together, that referrals were being made appropriately across agencies, and that agencies were doing what they could to support a group of individuals that was not being served to the best of our abilities. But it has been a big change. Those of you that are working in the system can attest to that, I'm sure. So the Ticket to Work and Work Incentives Improvement Act is really there to support beneficiaries of Social Security disability benefits. So those individuals that are on Social Security, it's a myth that prevails that individuals that are receiving Social Security benefits are not able to work. They can't work, or they shouldn't work. That's kind of the societal perception that somebody with a disability shouldn't work, right? But there have been these incentive programs that have been put into place by the Social Security Administration that helps support individuals that want to try to go back into the workforce, to integrate back into the workforce, without having to worry about losing their benefits right off the bat. Because sometimes people might try to go back to work or be working for a couple of months, something happens, and it ends up not working out. Essentially, somebody that has spent a good deal of time trying to get Social Security disability benefits doesn't want to have to go through the entire process again, if it was just that they tried to go back to work for a 3-month period. So there are these programs in place. A go-to guide for all things related to Social Security is something called the Red Book, and it's something that comes out annually. It's updated annually. It not only provides information about the benefit itself and how it's provided to people in this country, but it also provides information about the incentive programs that are out there and available to individuals that may very well be on your caseload. Again, these are things that you should know about for later on when you're working. Moving quite quickly through all this, and workers' compensation. Got to be honest, workers' compensation is one of the things I have liked least in my career as a professional counselor. I don't like workers' compensation because it's different state by state. It gives me a personal headache. But the purpose of it really is to provide some protection to employers and employees whenever an employee has been injured on the job. So the difference between workers' compensation and, let's say, family medical leave, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the Rehab Act, is that workers' comp is very, very specific to work-related injuries. So eligibility is based on whatever state law says around workers' compensation. Enforcement is at the state level. Federal employees are covered in a different way by the OWCP, but they also have protections if they get injured on the job as well. It's just different than what our state protections might be. Workers' compensation might be managed by different different entities depending on the state. Here in West Virginia, it's Brook Street. rehab counselors can work for workers' compensation companies. It's actually a pretty lucrative job in the greater scheme of things. And so the job of the rehab counselor is to essentially help that injured worker be able to come back to work sooner than later, possibly with modifications. There's lots of different terminology that's used in workers' compensation. Things like if somebody is a percentage classified as a percentage disabled, quote unquote disabled, like permanently disabled, that's workers' comp language. Maximum medical improvement, workers' comp language. Light duty, those two words, light duty, workers' comp. I would often run into issues where an employer would receive a note from a doctor saying that their employee needed to return to work on light duty when the employee was not injured on the job. So there can be a lot of confusion whenever somebody writes light duty. Mental health care workers, it can be included in that group. Light duty just isn't necessarily helpful if somebody is not actually going through a workers' comp claim or was injured on the job. There are a lot of return to work programs that have been established within state systems of workers' compensation that work really well, that they're getting employees back on the job, which is a massive benefit not only to the employee who obviously needs the income, but also to the employer because they don't have to retrain somebody. They don't have to bring in like a temp worker. Having a worker out of work actually costs employers money. If somebody is on leave or if they're pulling from workers' comp. There's also that possibility or potential for somebody to be covered under a workers' compensation law, the workers' compensation laws, in addition to the Americans with Disabilities Act, or somebody might have been on workers' comp, was injured on the job, reached maximum medical improvement, workers' comp claim gets closed, but then kind of their situation and issue just seamlessly transitions into an Americans with Disabilities Act issue. So there can be a lot of overlap, which tends to cause confusion. Thinking about healthcare, the big piece of legislation that's important to us as counselors is HIPAA, of course, established in 1996, and really the purpose of it was so that medical entities, doctors, dentists, counselors, we're not sharing confidential information. Employers generally aren't considered a covered entity under HIPAA, but counselors can be a covered entity. So it's important to figure out where you're working later on and whether or not you and the employer that you're working for will be considered a covered entity. There are privacy rules under HIPAA, security rules in terms of protecting electronic health records. There are rules that I teach it in my ethics class, but we talk about encryption. And so HIPAA kind of outlines specifically what counselors should be doing and medical providers and medical entities should be doing to protect that information that we keep in electronic databases now. And that extends to work that we do that's virtual. So if we're doing telehealth, or virtual counseling, you want to make sure that you're doing it in a way that protects the client to the best of your abilities, with the understanding that things that are out there in the electronic world aren't 100% on lockdown, right? Because there are lots of breaches that can happen. Other healthcare related acts, I've listed these on slide 11, and I would expect that the ones that you guys are going to be talking about within your assignments are going to be focused on these. The Affordable Care Act is one that we know is hotly contested right now, and who knows what or how that will change. But it may be that you're working with clients that are receiving insurance benefits through the Affordable Care Act. Things like the Support Act and the Mental Health Parity Addiction Equity Act, those are related to individuals in recovery and the ability of individuals in recovery to have equal access to services, to not be discriminated against in terms of billing policies for insurance companies. And of course, there are laws like the Children's Health Act that as it would state, are related to children. And so if you're thinking about working with children or adolescents, youth, it may be beneficial for you to kind of dig into those laws a little bit further for this assignment. Title I of the ADA, in terms of healthcare, does have a provision where employers can't discriminate against employees with disabilities in terms of the healthcare that they're being provided. That has even been strengthened to a greater degree with the Affordable Care Act. State-specific regulations, I mean, that's going to vary minute by minute, day by day, depending on the state that somebody lives in. And so that's why it's important to keep up with the changes in legislation, the changes in legislative policy. And one of the go-to sites that you want to explore that I've put on this module is the ACA's government policy site. And so the ACA will frequently, honestly, push out information about different changes in the legislation, federal legislation that could be impactful to us, to counselors, individuals who hold an LPC, and clients as well. To note, state legislatures also impose changes on an annual basis, and so when you become an LPC, it's important again to maintain contact with your LPC board, because typically they'll post information about that on their website as well. Education-related legislation largely includes the IDEA and FERPA, which essentially would provide IDEA equal access to education for individuals with disabilities. FERPA is protection of information in the educational system, privacy of information, school records, and things of that nature. FERPA is really important for school counselors to learn about, because this is something that's unique to school counselors is that the case notes that they take become part of a student's file, and so technically parents have access to case notes. So until somebody turns 18, or the age of majority, I think is what it is. So it's important for school counselors to be very careful and very considerate of their students when they're writing up their case notes and documenting things. Education-related legislation is enforced by the Department of Education. Figures, right? That makes sense. Other employment-related legislation, the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, that's also enforced by the EEOC. Fair Labor Standards Act. Well, so age discrimination basically prohibits employers from making any kind of employment-related decision, whether it's hiring or firing, based solely on somebody's age. This is a really important one if you're working with older individuals. That's typically the population that's discriminated against for ADEA. Older individuals getting booted out simply because they've reached a certain age. Fair Labor Standards Act, that's one that basically tells employers you can't work your employees like 24 hours without giving them a break. Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act prohibits employers from making employment decisions based on my genetic information or what they perceive to be my genetic information. I give the example of, like, if my mother had been diagnosed with breast cancer, and then my employer decides to drop me from their insurance because they are concerned that I will have breast cancer at some point in the future. That's something that the GINA could potentially cover. Pregnancy Discrimination Act is not great, but it's improving. Essentially, it again prohibits employers from discriminating against women who are pregnant in all areas of employment. So you can't refuse to hire somebody who is pregnant simply because they're pregnant. You can't terminate a woman who's pregnant simply because they're pregnant. The middle part of it is the accommodations piece of it, where the enforcement agency for this is also the EEOC. They have stated in guidance documents that they would like employers to make accommodations for women who are pregnant similarly to what they would do for individuals with disabilities. Technically, the law doesn't really state that, and so there's a lot of there can be a lot of leeway in how it's interpreted, unfortunately, but that is the way that it is. Every year, EEOC puts out information, all these agencies, I should say, put out information about the number of complaints that were received, discrimination complaints for each of these pieces of legislation, each of these laws. We like to see improvement, meaning that we like to see that not as many complaints have been filed against employers, entities, counselors, because hopefully that means that people are more aware of what their obligations are, how they need to be treating individuals that are members of different populations. Unfortunately, the numbers aren't at zero. They're very far from that. And so still see that with the EEOC especially, that claims against employers based on discrimination around disability status are still very high. And so, you know, it is what it is. But now I think you kind of have the rundown of each of these laws. It's a lot of information, I get that. It's a little mundane, I get that. But it's useful. Even if you're not going into a specific rehab counseling track, it is very useful for you to be familiar with these laws and familiar with who you can go to, entities you can go to, websites you can go to for more information. Because remember, our clients aren't coming to us typically because everything is going perfectly in their lives, right? So they're needing some assistance, they're needing some help, and our ability to point them in the right direction and help them navigate the world of legislation, what it breaks down to is advocacy. And so we are advocating for the client, we're advocating with the client, and we are most importantly, in my opinion, helping the client become their own self-advocate, which is really important. So with that, I can't believe I got this down to like 31 minutes, so I'll leave it at that, and I'll keep checking in over the next 2 weeks with you guys, okay?